Evening slowly enveloped Manhattan, its noisy streets and glass skyscrapers reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. A crowd of tourists and townspeople flowed like a living stream along the winding alleys leading to the Statue of Liberty. Here, under the shadow of the famous symbol of independence, stood Miles Hadley, a young officer of the National Guard. His figure was the embodiment of restraint and strength, motionless yet filled with inner tension. The crimson uniform, polished boots, and perfectly polished ceremonial rifle. Everything in his appearance exuded flawlessness. But this evening was not like the others. There was something strange in the air, as if the very atmosphere was preparing for something unpredictable. The crowd around buzzed, laughter, children's screams, conversations in different languages merged into a chaotic hum. Many stopped in front of the memorial, took photos, filmed the officers, trying to catch the slightest movement, which, as they believed, was part of the theater. Miles had long been accustomed to this attention. It did not bother him, but today he felt particularly tense. As a former soldier, he possessed an innate ability to sense the slightest changes in the environment, and now something was clearly wrong. Loud laughter cut through the evening air, escaping from a small group of young men standing near a food truck nearby. 3 men, each holding a beer can, stood out from the crowd with their behavior. Their speech was loud and incoherent, and their gait was unsteady. The leader of this trio, Joel Baines, was a burly guy with disheveled hair and a stretched-out t-shirt with a faded logo of some football club. His confidence as a drunk person exuded a challenge to the whole world. "Just look at these guys," Joel said, shaking his head toward the officers, his voice loud with a hint of mockery. "Standing here like damn mannequins. What are they even needed for?" "Just relax, Joel," muttered one of his friends, but there was no real resistance in his tone. Rather, it was a pitiful excuse to avoid conflict. But Joel was not one to back down. In his eyes shone a mixture of challenge and self-confidence. He took a sip of beer and crushed the empty can under his foot. "I'll go tell him what I think of his job," he announced, straightening his shoulders. His friends exchanged glances but did not try to stop him. The crowd around continued to live its life, not noticing the approaching threat. Miles noticed Joel as soon as he stepped out of the shadow, his loud laughter and defiant gait immediately attracting attention. Years of service had taught Miles to observe people, read their movements, assess their intentions, even before they manifested. Joel crossed the small square, leaving a trail of crushed cigarette butts and empty cans behind him. His confidence grew with each step. "Hey, buddy!" he shouted, stopping in front of Miles. His voice echoed off the granite slabs. "Do you think standing like a statue is a job?" The crowd began to fall silent. Those who were nearby turned around warily, sensing the brewing conflict. Some took out their phones, others hastily averted their gaze, preferring not to get involved. Miles stood motionless. His gaze was fixed forward, his hands gripping the rifle tightly. The only movement was a slight twitch of his jaw, an almost imperceptible sign of inner tension. "Oh, you won't even move," Joel continued, circling Miles. His words grew louder, sounding like a challenge. "Come on, show something, soldier boy. You're not just for show, are you?" The crowd around began to gather closer, like spectators around a stage. Parents hurriedly led children away, but most adults remained, captivated by the tension that was growing like a thundercloud. Miles remained silent. His immobility only provoked Joel more. "Maybe you're just scared," Joel blurted out, his face contorted in a smirk. "Or do you think you're too important to talk to ordinary people?" Miles maintained a silent dignity, but inside him grew the realization. This situation was not just another drunken antic. Joel was approaching a line that could not be crossed. A heavy silence hung in the air. The crowd held its breath. Something inevitable seemed about to happen. The crowd around Miles Hadley began to thicken, like storm clouds before a storm. People stood half-turned, their bodies seemingly trying to move away from the impending conflict, but their eyes, full of tense curiosity, were riveted to what was happening. Joel Baines was staggering, completed a circle around the officer and stopped right in front of him. His gaze, inflamed by alcohol, slid up, stopping on the perfectly polished rifle, then on the impeccably fitted uniform, and finally on Miles' motionless face. "You can't even answer, can you?" he growled, spitting out the words with contempt. "You're just standing here like a battery-operated toy." There was more in his voice than drunken aggression. It was a protest against something big that he couldn't even articulate. But Joel was not the kind of person who analyzes his feelings. Instead, he clenched his fists, his hand trembling with a mixture of anger and alcohol. Miles remained unmoved. Inside him raged a conflict familiar to anyone who has worn a uniform. He was used to insults, used to being a symbol for others' projections. For some, he was the embodiment of strength and honor. For others, just a soldier boy. But now something inside him began to crack. Not from Joel's words, they were primitive and predictable, but from the feeling that this person had gone too far. Every movement of Joel's, every taunt cut through Miles like an exposed nerve. Not because he felt humiliated, but because this drunk, self-satisfied person was playing with a symbol that Miles considered sacred. The uniform he wore was not just clothing, it represented duty, honor, heritage. It was a reminder of those who had stood guard before him, who had sacrificed for something greater. But Joel did not understand this. For him, the uniform was just a prop, and the officer, a decoration that could be manipulated for his amusement. "You probably think you're too good for us, don't you?" Joel continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "And you know what? Your boots," he pointed at Miles' perfectly polished shoes, "they look damn boring. Let's make them more interesting." The crowd gasped as Joel stepped back, raised his foot, and forcefully kicked a small fountain of water from a street puddle right into Miles' boots. Droplets flew in all directions, leaving dark stains on the crimson fabric of the uniform. Inside Miles, something snapped. His eyes, previously fixed on nothing, barely perceptibly moved forward. It was an almost imperceptible movement, but those who were watching him felt it. It was not anger, not fear. It was a deep realization. The line had been crossed. But despite this, Miles remained motionless. His body remained motionless, like a statue. But inside him raged a storm. He remembered the training camps where they repeated to him, "You are more than just soldiers. You are symbols. You are not people when you stand on duty. You are the embodiment of discipline." But how far could a person go remaining a symbol? The crowd began to whisper. Someone was filming on their phone. Someone was quietly indignant. But no one intervened. Joel, seeing that his action did not cause the expected reaction, felt a surge of self-confidence. He approached closer, now standing right next to Miles. "Still not moving?" he whispered, leaning closer so that his words reached only the officer's ears. "Maybe you should take off that silly hat. It looks like it's been squeezing your brains for too long." The tension in the crowd grew. An elderly man, his face etched with wrinkles, clearly a veteran, stood at the edge. His hands were clenched into fists, his wife quietly pleading with him not to intervene. "This is not your battle, Jim," she whispered. "You won't prove anything." "It's not about the battle," he hissed, not taking his eyes off Miles. "It's about damn respect." Joel stepped back again, now swinging for something bigger. His friends laughed quietly behind him, but doubt was written on their faces. They understood that the situation was going too far. "Well, are you going to show us you're alive?" Joel shouted, reaching out towards Miles' ceremonial rifle. His fingers trembled, and he made a sharp movement, as if trying to grab the weapon. At that moment, the crowd froze. There was a sense in the air that something was about to happen. Joel stopped inches away from the rifle. He smirked, turned around, and threw his empty can right at the officer's feet. "See? You're nothing. Just a uniform, just a prop." His voice was filled with triumph. "And me? I'm alive, real, and I'll prove it to you." Miles continued to stand motionless, but his gaze was fixed forward with a sharpness that subconsciously made several people in the crowd take a step back. Inside him, a reverse reaction began, like a spring compressed to the limit. The evening New York fell silent, as if the air on the square had absorbed the tension created by one person. Joel Baines, intoxicated by alcohol and the illusory power over the motionless officer, now felt like the master of the situation. His friends stood behind him, having taken a few steps back. Their faces no longer expressed enthusiasm for Joel's behavior. Fear flickered in their eyes. Fear of the relentlessly approaching boundary that even they understood. But Joel did not notice this. His attention was riveted to the motionless figure of Miles Hadley, standing like an unshakable statue. Miles' immobility irritated him the most. Joel lived in a world where strength was expressed in loud words and aggressive gestures. He could not understand that the person standing before him possessed a different kind of strength, a strength that did not need a showy demonstration. "Do you even understand who you're standing in front of?" Joel shouted, addressing the crowd more than Miles himself. "I, for crying out loud, am a taxpayer. It's my money that pays you to stand here like furniture." The crowd held its breath. Someone whispered something to their neighbor. Someone furtively filmed the scene on their phone. The onlookers' gazes darted between the motionless guardsman and the enraged Joel. People instinctively felt that this would not end with just words. Joel took another step forward. Now he stood so close to Miles that his sour, alcohol-laden breath washed over the officer's face. "Or maybe you're not even human," Joel sneered. "Maybe you're just a robot, like those things they show on TV. Don't you feel anything?" He reached out his hand, almost touching Miles' shoulder, but at the last moment pulled it back. "Or are you afraid you'll be fired if you move even once?" With each word, Joel provoked not only Miles but also the crowd. Some of the onlookers began to talk louder, discussing why no one was intervening. Parents hurriedly led their children away. Others, however, remained. Perhaps they were waiting for justice. Perhaps they just needed something to talk about over dinner. Miles felt the tension inside him growing. His breathing remained steady, his posture impeccable, but his entire being told him that the moment was approaching. Military training had taught him patience, discipline, endurance. But it had also taught him that sometimes a moment comes when action becomes necessary, not for himself, but for what he represents. Joel stepped back, his face contorted in a smirk. He pulled another beer can from his back pocket, loudly opened it, and raised it in a mocking gesture. "To your health, robot!" he shouted before beginning to pour the foamy liquid onto Miles' polished boots. The crowd erupted in gasps and quiet exclamations. Several people covered their mouths, unable to believe what was happening. An elderly veteran standing to the side took a step forward, but his wife grabbed his arm again. "Don't, Jim," she whispered. "This is not our battle." "No, it's everyone's battle who understands what honor is," he replied, but still stopped. The liquid dripped down Miles' boots, leaving dirty streaks on the perfectly polished leather. This was more than just a provocation. It was an insult not only to him, but to everything he represented. His uniform, his service, his duty, all of it was attacked by this act. But Miles did not move. He heard the crowds whisper, felt their tension. He saw everything, how Joel's hand gripped the can, how his friends shifted from foot to foot, clearly wanting to leave but not daring to. He noticed the smallest details, drops of beer falling to the pavement, Joel's sweaty face contorted in stupid self-confidence. And then Joel did what finally broke the barrier of patience. He threw the empty can in Miles's face. The can bounced off the officer's chest, leaving a barely noticeable dent on his uniform. That was the last straw. The crowd fell silent, as if everyone suddenly forgot how to breathe. Joel stood smirking, thinking he had won, but he did not know that the person standing before him had already made a decision. Inside Miles, the spring compressed to the limit. He remembered the instructor's lessons at the military base. You can endure to infinity, but if someone crosses the line, you act quickly and precisely, without emotions, without hesitation. The crowd watched as Miles slowly inhaled, his chest rising under his uniform. It was a movement that in any other situation would have seemed routine, but now it seemed like the beginning of something huge. Time seemed to freeze and everyone on the square felt it. The calm was deceptive. Miles knew. He was waiting for the right moment to restore order. The crowd on the square froze, as if the whole world had stopped moving. Even the wind seemed to have ceased its flow, not wanting to disrupt the moment hanging in the air. Joel Baines stood before Miles Hadley, self-satisfiedly smirking, as if the victor in a battle he himself had invented. His friends exchanged glances as if expecting something irreparable to happen at any moment. The tension had become almost physically palpable, an electric charge ready to discharge. Miles, still motionless as a rock, allowed the moment to linger a fraction of a second longer than necessary. In his head, every instruction he had ever heard in training rang crystal clear. Discipline, patience, proportionality of response. But now all that gave way to the instinct honed by years of service? Joel had crossed a line that left no choice. "What, soldier boy?" Joel shouted, his voice ringing like a gunshot in an empty room. "Are you even alive? Maybe you're just a doll in that uniform of yours?" These words drowned in the silence of the crowd, which now kept its distance, as if sensing the imminent explosion. The veteran, standing to the side, silently watched, his hand no longer resting on his wife's shoulder. She looked at him anxiously, but he did not take his eyes off Miles. And then it happened. With a movement that was almost imperceptible, Miles slightly shifted his stance. For most, it looked like an innocent transfer of weight from one foot to the other, but for those who understood body language, it was a signal. His right foot, previously immovable, began to move with the precision and speed that could be called perfect. In the next second, everything happened so quickly that the crowd did not even have time to blink. Miles's boot, polished to a mirror shine, described a perfect arc and found its target with surgical precision. The kick landed in Joel's groin with such force that he literally flew several inches off the ground, emitting a sound more like a choking squeak than a scream. The crowd gasped, and this gasp seemed to roll in a wave across the entire square. Joel crashed to the ground, clutching his stomach and writhing in pain. His self-confidence, his mocking tone, his rude behavior, all of it vanished in an instant. Now he was just a person learning from his mistakes in the harshest way. Miles, having already returned to his original position, stood just as motionless as before. His face remained expressionless, and his gaze was still fixed in the distance, as if nothing had happened. This was a scene worthy of a military parade, but the difference was that behind this perfect discipline lay an iron will and an awareness of responsibility for his action. Joel, lying on the pavement, continued to writhe in pain. His friends, who a minute ago had supported his antics, now stood silently, their faces pale. One of them tried to take a step forward but stopped, noticing how Miles slightly tensed his left arm, as if warning that there would be a lesson for him too if necessary. Some of the onlookers began to applaud. It was not a loud, enthusiastic applause, but rather a respectful, cautious gesture. The veteran, who had been watching the whole scene, nodded briefly, his face expressing satisfaction. "That was perfect," he said softly, almost in a whisper, but his words were heard by his wife. She just sighed, understanding that nothing could be changed anymore. Someone in the crowd took out their phone and began calling the police. Others just stood, captivated by what was happening, unable to look away. On their faces was a mixture of shock, respect, and strange relief. The police arrived a few minutes later. They moved confidently but without haste, as if knowing that the situation was already under control. The senior officer, a tall man with graying temples, approached Miles and nodded briefly to him. "You handled it, officer," he said calmly, and then turned to Joel, who was struggling to sit up, holding his stomach. "And you, sir, will be detained for disorderly conduct and insulting a member of the National Guard." Joel did not respond. He was too consumed by his own pain and perhaps thoughts of how he ended up in this situation. When the police led Joel away, the crowd began to disperse. People talked among themselves, discussing what had happened. Some were still filming, and someone quietly said that people like Miles deserved more respect. Miles remained standing at his post as if nothing had happened. His boots still shone, despite the dirt that had been splashed on them minutes earlier. His uniform looked flawless, and his face remained a mask of calm. Everything that had happened was now in the past, but the crowd was left with a new memory that would likely become a legend. This scene would remain in people's minds as a reminder that immobility and patience do not always mean weakness, and sometimes behind them lies a strength ready to act when necessary. When the police car with Joel Baines drove away, the square began to come back to life, but not with the previous noise. The crowd dispersed slowly, like water leaving the shores after a storm. Conversation sounded muted. Everyone whispered about what they had seen, as if afraid to disturb the fragile balance that had been established in this place. Miles Hadley stood just as motionless as before the incident. His posture remained a model of discipline, and his face a motionless mask. But inside him, emotions still raged. He remembered that precise moment when the spring inside him compressed to the limit, and he had to act. It was not a burst of anger, but a conscious, carefully calculated movement, the result of years of training and preparation. He knew he had done the right thing, but he still felt a slight taste of doubt. Had he gone too far? Several people approached closer to look at Miles. Among them was the elderly veteran who had been watching the situation from the beginning. His wife tried to lead him away, but he stopped in front of the officer, took off his worn baseball cap with the logo of the U.S. Armed Forces, and slightly bowed. "Thank you for your service," he said softly, his voice firm but respectful. Miles barely nodded, not breaking his posture. It was his only movement, but it meant more than words. The veteran, nodding in response, stepped back, urged by his wife. "He did what he had to do," the man said to his wife as they left, "and he did it perfectly." At the other end of the square, several teenagers were discussing what had happened. One of them, a tall guy with a camera on his chest, shouted, "I filmed it all! Did you see how he knocked him out? He's a real hero, officer." "A hero," his girlfriend muttered, flashing a reproachful glance. "He was just doing his job." "Exactly," the guy said. "And now the whole world will see that these people are not just statues." The crowd began to disperse, some left with approval on their faces, others with an expression of confusion. But almost no one remained indifferent. The incident stirred emotions, making people think about symbols, duty, and respect for them. As the square emptied, Miles replayed the events in his head. He remembered Joel's face, self-confident, defiant, annoying. But what bothered him most was not that. He wondered why Joel had behaved that way. Was it just stupidity caused by alcohol, or something more? A manifestation of contempt, a loss of respect for those who wear the uniform? His training had taught him to restrain emotions, but deep down, Miles understood. The incident with Joel was not just a display of disrespect. It was a symptom of something broader, that society was increasingly losing touch with the concepts of duty, honor, and traditions. Miles understood that he was not just a person in uniform, but a symbol for all who looked at him. And when someone attacked him, they attacked the very essence of his mission. But he also knew, the world is unfair. Service is never easy. Being a guardsman meant more than just standing on duty. It meant being an example. Even when it's hard, even when you're face to face with contempt and ridicule. Miles glanced across the square, noticing the last silhouettes of departing people. On the surface, he was still the same motionless guard, but inside him, the struggle continued. He took a deep breath, allowing the cool evening air to fill his lungs, and regained control of his mind. Nothing had changed. He stood as proud and straight as before. A man with his son passed by, and the boy, stopping, looked at Miles with respect. "He really doesn't move, Dad," the boy whispered, wide-eyed. "That's because he's a real soldier," his father replied. "Remember that." Miles heard these words and felt his resolve strengthen. He knew that everything that had happened today had only reinforced what he embodied. Sometimes being a symbol meant taking hits, but also returning them when necessary. When the square finally emptied, Miles was left alone with his thoughts and the silence of the New York night. For others, this day was just another story to take home. But for Miles, it was a reminder. His service was not just a pose. It was a choice he made every day. A choice to protect not just territory, but the very essence of honor and traditions. Several days had passed since that evening spectacle at the Statue of Liberty Plaza. The story, like a flame, spread through social media, reaching the entire internet. Videos shot by eyewitnesses garnered millions of views. Headlines ranged from "Guardsmen taught a lesson in respect" to "National Guard officers' moment of glory." Discussions erupted worldwide. Some supported Miles' actions, calling his deed a symbol of strength, while others thought he had gone too far. But Miles Hadley, as if detached from all the buzz, continued his service. For him, nothing had changed. His uniform was still polished to a shine, his boots gleamed, reflecting the light, and his gaze remained focused and steady. The next day after the incident, Miles was called to his commander's office. His commander, Colonel Randall Carter, was an experienced military man whose years of service had left deep wrinkles on his face and a voice as firm as stone. "Sit down, Hadley," he began, pointing to a chair in front of his massive oak desk. Photos on the walls of his office reminded of the tough years of service. Among them were snapshots of his platoon taken during the height of combat operations in Iraq. Miles sat down, his back straight, his gaze unwavering. "You know why you're here?" Carter continued, folding his hands on the desk. "This story has spread across all channels. We've had calls from the press, even from Washington. Some consider you a hero, others an example of excessive aggression. But let me tell you this, soldier. I saw the footage. You did everything right." Miles nodded slightly but said nothing. He knew that any comment could be misinterpreted. His duty was not to speak but to act, and he had acted when it was necessary. "You taught a lesson not only to that idiot, but to everyone who thinks they can insult those who wear the uniform with impunity." Carter allowed himself a rare smile. "And if I could, I would shake your hand right now. But let's do this. Keep doing what you're doing. You are an example, remember that." Meanwhile, on the square, a new sign had been hung with a warning: any offensive behavior towards National Guard officers is prohibited. But what attracted even more attention was not the text on the sign, but how visitors began to behave around the guard posts. Tourists who used to laugh and try to tease them now fell silent in their presence. Parents stopped their children, explaining to them that these people represented honor and traditions. One of these visitors was a middle-aged man who brought his 10-year-old son to the memorial. They stopped in front of Miles, standing on duty, and the boy froze, staring at the motionless officer. "Dad, he's not moving at all," the boy whispered, not taking his eyes off him. "He only moves when it's absolutely necessary," his father replied. "That's called discipline. You can learn it too if you want." Miles heard these words but gave no sign. Inside, he felt a warm glow. His service, his immobility, all of it was now becoming a lesson for someone. Later, when Miles returned to the barracks, he allowed himself to relax a bit. He sat on a wooden bench and looked at his boots. They were perfectly clean, despite the dirty beer that had been splashed on them not long ago. This moment made him smile. He thought about how easy it would have been to just brush it all off, leave that day in the past. But for him, it was more than just an incident. It was a lesson, not just for Joel, but for the whole society. People forget that behind symbols stand people. Symbols like the uniform are not just decorations. They represent history, efforts, and sacrifices of those who wore them before him. Miles remembered his father, who also wore the uniform, and taught him the most important thing. Honor is not something given to you. It is something you uphold. These words echoed in his head when he stood on the square, and these words now resonated in every step he took. In the evening of the next day, the square was again filled with tourists. Under the soft light of the lanterns, Miles stood at his post, tall and motionless. The crowd around him behaved differently now. Now people looked at him with respect. Some even nodded briefly as they passed, as if acknowledging his importance. And somewhere in the crowd was the veteran who had come again to look at Miles. This time he came alone, without his wife. He stopped at a distance, saluted, and lingered for a moment before leaving. When the square emptied, only shadows and the echo of footsteps remained on the pavement. Miles Hadley continued to stand guard, motionless and proud. In his immobility lay a strength that transcended words, actions, or even the uniform itself. It was the strength of duty, the strength of respect, and most importantly, the strength of a person who embodies traditions worthy of eternity. And on this night, under the starry sky of New York, Miles knew that his place was here, on duty, protecting not just a building or a symbol, but the very idea of honor.